Nuestro siguiente invitado está convencido de que gracias a los grandes desarrolladores de JavaScript, la web está conociendo uno de los momentos evolutivos más apasionantes. Con los nuevos cambios se pueden crear atractivas interfaces de usuario y favorecer así la experiencia con sofisticadas interacciones. Pero bueno, casi mejor que lo cuente él. Viene de empresas como VeriSign, VMware o BT, defensor de los estándares web y el código abierto. Actualmente es director técnico de la agencia londinense RGA y un auténtico apasionado del código. Recibimos en este escenario a Phil Hawksworth.
Good morning. First, an apology. This talk is going to be entirely in English. I apologize for that. I know that there's some simultaneous translation going on. Appeal to the people doing that translation, make me look smarter and make me look cleverer than I am. That would be most useful. A quick introduction. First of all, my name's Phil Hawksworth, an agency in London called RGA. We're a big kind of traditional ad agency that's evolved over the years, and now we're building all kinds of platforms and products. And I'm particularly interested in building things for the web. The talk I'm going to give is entitled Excessive Enhancement. I've actually given this talk before. I was quite excited at that point to be talking about it. There was some chatter on Twitter ahead of that saying, great, looking forward to Phil's talk on sex enhancements. That's not what this is. I can't emphasize that enough. It's not sex enhancements, it's excessive enhancements. That other talk is a different talk, and I'm really not that guy. So I'm just basically a big JavaScript nerd. And more than that, I'm a kind of front-end developer nerd, and I care passionately about the web. So as you might imagine, I've got a bit of a front-end focus to what I care about. You know, I like bleeding-edge visual effects in browsers that we can do nowadays. I'm very aware of browser performance and kind of care deeply about that. And also this kind of browser shizzle, the exciting shit you can do in the browsers now, because it's an exciting time. And a little while ago, when I was attending a conference in the UK called Full Frontal, which again is a JavaScript conference, I was introduced at that point to Node.js, which is a technology anyone who cares about JavaScript probably has come across. And Simon Willison, who's a very smart guy, gave an interesting talk on Node.js, which really was the first example that I was aware of seeing JavaScript on the server done in a way that really justified it being there. And I wanted to go and learn more about this, obviously, so afterwards, couldn't remember the technology exactly, but I wanted to find out about more, about what Simon had spoken about. So I went off to Google and was searching for Simon Willison Full Frontal. And it takes a brave man to go and search for that, because you're never quite sure what you're going to get. You kind of want to add your own search parameters to try and make sure you don't see any of Simon's fleshy parts. And thankfully, I didn't, but I learned more about that, and it's very exciting. But that's an example now of how JavaScript can be used for the whole gamut of web development, both the front end and the back end. We've got like the whole pantomime cow, if you like, of web development covered for JavaScripters. But the thing that's really exciting at the moment is this browser shizzle, the exciting stuff you can do in the browser, because it's an exciting time. Now we can do all kinds of rich animation. We can do all kinds of 3D effects and interesting rendering. And there's options for all kinds of interesting dynamic data visualization that we can do in these modern browsers. But I want to issue a bit of a word of caution. Now, I'm aware you don't know me, and when we're going to come to an event like this and talk about exciting things you can do, and there's some nice examples that people will be giving later on of what we can do now, you don't really want to have someone wagging his finger at you and saying, just be careful about how you use it. But if you're not going to listen to me, listen to one of the foremost scientists, the great minds of our time, Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park. I don't know if you remember this quote, but I think it's really apt for the moment, where his character said that the scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. And I think that's really appropriate for the time that we're in now with the kind of technologies and the browser capabilities that we've got. Now, in Jurassic Park, there were particular repercussions if you didn't take care. And that's not quite the same impact for us in the web development world. But certainly when designing interactions for for use on computers, then there's still implications of doing things just because you can. I don't know if you remember this from Jurassic Park as well. Insane user interface into the Unix system, hooray. So there's a risk for me that I could be, the wet blanket of this conference, Captain Killjoy, and I don't want to be the one who says you shouldn't run with scissors and you mustn't eat with your mouth open, but frankly, this stuff is kind of important. So the question for me really is, are we going too far with JavaScript to enhance our sites? And remember, I'm a JavaScript nerd, I love JavaScript. So I'm kind of reminded a little bit of a time where, when I worked at British Telecom in the UK, the group that I worked in was organising an event, and a couple of us were asked if we'd put together some posters, some presentations to go along with our stand, if you like. And I like to think of myself as someone who can create interesting, kind of nice visual renderings. So I went off and opened up Photoshop and started pushing pixels around, creating lots of content that had shiny surfaces and drop shadows and all the rest of it. And a good friend of mine, a guy called Paul Downey, PSD on Twitter, went off with a pen and some paper, and he drew this thing, which he dubbed an Uber doodle about the web. It's called the Web is Agreement, and you may have come across this on Flickr. And this thing is just incredibly dense. It's really rich with information, and I won't try and get you to see it all now because there's too much going on, but I love the fact that it's got this road that's kind of paved with the URI, which is one of the building blocks of the web that runs through it. And we've got, on one side, all of the kind of the good approaches and the light, and then some of the slightly more opinionated, darker things on the other side. I mean, we've got Google's all-seeing eye at the top, and Mordorsoft, whatever that might be, spewing out fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's fairly full of opinion. Some of it you'd agree with, some maybe you don't. But I kind of like things like this, where we've got the principles mound, which is atop by the W3C and the IETF, the governing bodies of the web, and all of these principles that go along with it. And I also like, I don't know if you can make it out, but there's things like the passport fracture up on the right there, a bit of a commentary on Microsoft trying to own identity on the web, which is mended by the OpenID repair. So it's full of all kinds of good stuff, and I really like it. And it had a bit of a message for me that I took a lot from. And just as I was starting to digest that and understand it, Paul did it again, and he drew this, something called the URI is the thing, which is insane. As much as anything, it kind of highlights that maybe he's got some issues that he's working out through his art, which is interesting, but it's incredibly dense. And again, it's kind of topped by Tim Berners-Lee, obviously the creator of the web, and Roy Fielding, who wrote the paper on REST principles. Again, really fundamental principles of the web. I'll share links to this so you can study it, because it's worth having a look at. But just to dig into one little part of it, just to give you an idea how dense it is. Here we've got, in this big labyrinth, which kind of describes how you navigate the web, some nice principles like your position is your state, and it highlights the importance of the back button. And I really like, the fact that we've got beware the cookie monster there, with the cookie monster right in the middle of it. But there's all kinds of good stuff, and I urge you to take a look at it should you get the chance. But the thing that those drawings really highlighted to me is this principle of agreement and the importance of the agreement on the web, and also the importance of the contract of the URI and how fundamental that is to the success of the web and how it helps it prosper. Now, this isn't going to turn into a lecture on REST or REST principles, but I think it's important that we should agree on this one thing, that if you make an HTTP GET request to some resource on the web, what you should get back is a representation of the content that lives at that resource. It's this principle of ask and you shall receive. And that's really fundamental. So back to why is this some kind of cautionary tale? Well, I think we're on the precipice of making some mistakes that we've made before. And a lot of that is because of this really seductive power of the possibilities that we've got now. Again, these incredibly capable browsers can do all kinds of exciting things, and we want to use them. Why would we not? Those capabilities kind of come under this umbrella of HTML5 that we're here to talk about today. There we go. We're back. So HTML5, whatever that is, because of course different people have different understanding of what HTML5 is. Most of us recognize it as being the latest evolution of the HTML specification and what that entails. But of course, lots of other technologies get bundled in with that. It's kind of a useful umbrella term. You know, when people talk about HTML5, sometimes they're actually talking about CSS3 or different browser APIs. So I'm actually going to do what the marketing guys do a lot and just call all of these exciting new things HTML5 just for the purposes of today. So the places we've made mistakes before with this stuff is in Flash development, right? And now I'm not a Flash hater. I think Flash is a fantastic technology, but it's been misused a lot. An old colleague of mine once dubbed me as being a member of the anti-Flash mob because he was sick of me kind of railing against Flash and being critical of it. But you know, there's definitely a bit of a snobby attitude of many web developers about the capabilities of Flash and how Flash is being used. Some of it's fair, and I think some of it's not. But certainly, there's some common criticisms that are worth kind of recalling. The most obvious one of those, perhaps, is about frozen content, about baking content into a container that you just stick onto the web. You know, often people criticize Flash for not allowing you to copy and paste the content that's rendered there, your navigation through a Flash site not being bookmarkable, the accessibility sometimes of those applications isn't great, and things can't be kind of searched and indexed by Google. That's kind of common criticism of Flash. Now, when I level that at one of my friends who's a real Flash advocate, an incredible designer, he'd say, but Flash can do that stuff, which is great for me. That's a great response, because then I can say, good, show me an example. Now, I've seen one or two examples of Flash doing things well, but more often than not, you see examples where really people who've created that have cared more about the aesthetic and about the pixels on the screen and how it looks than how it behaves and how it acts as a citizen of the web, you know, and the web fundamentals underneath. It's kind of understandable, perhaps, but you know, if that's because of what is valued by the developers who've created that, and perhaps also, more interestingly, how they got to be in the position where they were creating that in the first place. Now, I'm generalizing massively, but in my experience, lots of Flash developers have arrived at what they're doing through Photoshop. They've been incredibly talented designers often. And through using Photoshop and then different parts of the Adobe suite, they've arrived at Flash because that's an amazing way to bring their designs to life and start bringing out all kinds of interesting interactions. And that's often led a lot of people to creating Flash websites. Now, that's a fantastic example of caring more about the sex appeal of what you're creating than the fundamentals of the web. It's kind of a natural side effect of that, I think. And again, being seduced by the power of what they can now do with those tools. So over the years, I think it's fair to say that there's been an increased sophistication in the tools that we're using to create sites, in the capabilities of the browsers, and importantly, an increased sophistication in the expectation of the users. We all demand a lot more from our websites now than we ever did before. You know, we always want much richer user experiences. So to put that in context, it's worth perhaps looking back at the web once was. I mean, this purported to be the first website. You know, this is on CERN servers, and it's documentation about what the World Wide Web project will be. And this still exists. It functions just the same as it ever used to. It's perhaps not the most glamorous of sites, but it behaves as it should, and you know, it still exists in place now. Roll a bit forward from that to 1996, which, by the way, is the time that Jeff Goldblum had moved on from fighting dinosaurs to bringing down entire alien civilizations with his MacBook Pro. This is what the web looked like at that time. So this is McDonald's website. Many of you may have seen this in your travels. But it's interesting to me looking at this about what content is there. I mean, there's nothing there. There's no content at all. It's just a landing page, and you know, it has a nice animated GIF because we just learned how to do that, which is nice. But if you navigate through into that and into McDonald's website, this is the kind of content we were getting, and this is the kind of sophistication there was. We didn't even know how to interact with this, so we had to put instructions on here. So the instructions, you know, kind of read, just click on the adults or kids on the image to get into the site. So, you know, you click on the children in that image to get to the kids content, and you click on the adults to get into the adult content of McDonald's website. I don't quite know what the adult content on McDonald's website could be. I'm imagining some kind of sexy hamburgers. But the only other content that's on that page is a link to the fine print, so you can get to see their terms and conditions. It's hardly exciting or compelling stuff. This example, Pepsi's website from around the same time, 1996. So we'd obviously learned how to tile background images by that point, but the rest of it is just telling you what browser extensions and plugins you need to install in order to get in. Kind of a frightening time, and it's worth kind of remembering, I think. If we move on. I like this version, this site a little bit more. So this is Lego's site, again, 1996. It's definitely got the same kind of aesthetic as the others, but here we're starting to see some global navigation at least, but again, not the most sophisticated thing in the world. So let's bring it a bit more up to date. So end of last year, this site was launched initially in Germany and later rolled out across the US, and I think is pretty much global now. The example I've got here is of the German site. Many of you may have seen this because it certainly did the rounds, and lots of people were using it as an example of exciting things on the web, because this certainly has a much richer user experience than the sites we just looked at. And fantastically, it uses open web technology, so great. That's exactly the kind of thing that I would be excited about. But I kind of think it sucks a little bit, so apologies if you were involved in building it. Let's take a little look at it now. This is what it looks like when you load it up. OK, so that took about 13 seconds, and I captured that on a MacBook Pro connected to a super fast internet connection. 13 seconds. Now, I think we all can agree that 13 seconds is an eternity to wait for a web page to load. In the mobile context, it's maybe sometimes a bit more acceptable, but you could maybe argue that that shouldn't be the case. But either way, people aren't going to wait around 13 seconds, usually, for something which is ultimately just operator instructions. So there's no content there. We've waited 13 seconds. We've got something that just tells us that now we should scroll. That reminds me a little bit of the McDonald's site that we looked at earlier, because all we got there was instructions on how to interact with it. It's not necessarily the most compelling thing. So why did it take 13 seconds? Well, it turns out there's a good reason for that. One of the reasons is it's actually downloading 11 megabytes of images to get you to that point. And it's doing that using 251 individual HTTP requests. Now, anyone who's done any kind of performance optimization in the front end, which is where often that matters the most, knows that that's a shitload of HTTP requests. It's a lot of requests going on, a big overhead that's happening there. And if you look into it a little bit more, you'll also notice that the vast majority of those requests have no kind of cache expiration headers at all. So your browser doesn't know how to cache that stuff. So next time you visit the site, it's going to download those images all again. So it's not ideal. Now, it does do some things, right? As you interact with this page, as you move through it, it progressively loads more content. So in doing so, it grows to 15 megabytes of images and 316 HTTP requests to be this experience. And I kind of often refer to this as a bit of a bloated experience. Recently, Paul Irish has been kind of criticizing the use of the term bloated experience, saying just don't use that umbrella term. Think about where you can optimize things through the wire and in the front end, which I think is absolutely fair. Now, I've worked on quite a few car websites over the years, and they're all guilty to some extent or another of trying to do too much and trying to do lots of exciting things. This one is an example car website in the UK that I don't know for a fact, but I suspect didn't have a big expensive agency building it for them. It's maybe a good representation of a certain design aesthetic on the web. It reminds me a bit of GeoCities. And this is live now, and I have no idea how successful it is, but it's kind of insane. Now, so this, I think, probably wouldn't be an example of how we should be building sites. But even this one, has just a tiny, slender 4 megabytes of images. Still crazy, in my opinion. And this has 314 different HTTP requests, which, not surprising, because there are a gazillion images on there. So considering that comes in lighter than the big, expensive, optimized site, I think it's a bit of a sorry state. But let's look a little bit more at how this actually behaves. And as again, you may have seen this already, but as you scroll through, then we get all of these interesting kind of visual effects that a lot of them are using CSS3 techniques, and there's a lot of JavaScript going on in there. But things like this, I mean, this image where it's been sliced up and then the movement brings it into line, it's a real shame that images like that haven't been delivered as a sprite that are then sliced up in the browser. Each of those are just individual images. I feel we kind of know better than that now. And as you navigate through, it kind of updates the placeholder at the top for the global navigation. But you'll notice that the address doesn't change. You're just scrolling through a big blob of content. So this, I think, is a classic example of doing things because we can, and we found a way that we can make this stuff happen in the browser. Frankly, I imagine that at an agency, someone like myself has said, we've got this opportunity to do something cool, what can we do? And this has been the result. I think that if you really pressed Jeff Goldblum, you'd actually say that really is rather a lot of HTTP requests for a website about a car, which is certainly true. I think it's a bit excessive. And agreed, we haven't got the same implications, but I still think that it's a bit suboptimal. But with web standards, so it works on the iPhone. Awesome. Except that's not entirely true. So it turns out that if you hit the address of this on your laptop or your desktop machine, what you're going to get is what we looked at a second ago, which is this full version. So you're redirected to the full site. If you hit it in a mobile device, you'll get directed to the reduced version, which is similar design aesthetic, but a much more kind of pared down, slender version of it. And credit where credit's due, that's been beautifully done, and it's a lovely experience on your phone, as long as you're on Wi-Fi. It's still sending a lot of heavy images down there, but no, it's pretty nicely done. But the question I have then is, if the reason use open web standards perhaps was to make sure that it reaches all of these devices, we're kind of doing away with the advantages of that by just giving devices completely different code bases. So kind of wonder whether or not it was the right way to build it in the first place. So who cares about the iPhone? Who cares about the iPad? Well, I admit it, I do. I've got one of each and I love them. They're brilliant ways to experience things on the web. But critically, I think the people who really care that that stuff works on there are the people who sign the checks for these things to be developed. The CEOs of companies and the people in the high positions who are commissioning this work nowadays want to see this stuff working on their devices, and often it's a nice device like an iPhone or an iPad. That's a good thing and a bad thing, I think, because for many years I was talking about why we shouldn't just bake all of our content into Flash, and how it won't reach the widest audience. And no one really cared about that. Lots of people didn't, thought, well, that's fine, it works for me. But as soon as people like this got devices that didn't run Flash, then all of a sudden it became more of a priority, which is a fantastic side effect, I think, for people who care about the web. But it doesn't get past the fact that we're not necessarily targeting the audience. I mean, it's a great tool to get us there, but more critically now, people aren't just on the devices that we have amongst us in the room now. There's a much broader spectrum of devices that we need to cater for, and much less optimal environments for bandwidth and what have you. And those are the people that we need to be caring about a little bit more, I think. So, I don't want to just harp on about this site, but it's worth just looking at a tiny more. And you'll notice as I hover over, I don't know if you'll be able to see, but as I hover over the navigation, down at the bottom, there is in fact an actual URL that each of these pages has an address. So it's great. I was excited by that. I thought that they're probably something sensible, like hijacking links with JavaScript and then bringing the functionality in. But if JavaScript wasn't there, you'd still be able to navigate to those. Well, it's not quite the case. I mean, if you take a moment to look at what those addresses are and put those in your address bar, hit that site directly to those addresses, it doesn't understand them. It just pops you straight back to the root of this site. So it's not bookmarkable, and it's not addressable and navigable in the way that a website should be. We're back into those criticisms that we once leveled ourselves at Flash. I found it interesting that when this site did the rounds and everyone was talking about it, I was commenting on these kind of aspects about it. My colleague, the guy who called me a member of the anti-Flash mob, the designer, he had a slightly different criticism about it. Now, he was more concerned about why the fucking didn't fucking move. Because as the car moves around, the wheels don't go around. And his observation was that that's how cars work. The wheels do go around. So it was interesting to me that he was looking at a perspective that was all about what it looks like and how it behaves and the aesthetic, whereas I was looking at it from the opposite angle a little bit as well, saying, well, what about the fundamentals of the web? How does it behave as a citizen of the web? And we both felt like we were being shortchanged. So there's a common thing, obviously, we do when we're looking at how things have been implemented and the accessibility of sites, and that's to look at it without JavaScript. So let's do that. This is an example of it without JavaScript. And what you get is the landing page. There's no content there, nothing happens. If you squint up at the top, you can just see that it does care for the non-JavaScript user and say, please enable JavaScript. And it just uses the no-script tag just to kind of spit onto the page this unstyled bit of content. But largely, it just leaves you dangling. So it's a horrible experience. There's nothing there at that URL. So the rest of the content that's on that page, how do you get to it? URLs, URIs are what make the web a web. It's interconnected content. So this is an example of how sometimes we're forgetting about the fundamentals of how the web works, and certainly be used by the possibilities. Now, you could argue, we've been talking about this for, 15 minutes. It did the rounds, lots of people looked at this site and it got a lot of attention. So was it an effective campaign? Well, I don't know. I haven't got the data on that, but I'd certainly say that it got a lot of attention. And to many people, it could be considered to be an effective campaign. But what about the longevity of that site? How long is it going to be something that's useful and that we can link to? Will the links to content there actually work, really? Are we reaching all of the users that we need to? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe there's many more insights here than I'm aware of, and they've decided that actually just a very small subset of the web-enabled world we need to hit with this content. But I think issues like that are what changes a good campaign into a great campaign, and a good site into a great site. It's that level of care and attention that's really important. And I do care about the exciting stuff, but the fundamentals are important too. It's important that we should just easily be able to get the content. So let's move on to another, looking at Twitter. So anyone who works at Twitter will tell you that Twitter is not a website. Except, actually, it is, looks like. If you hit that in your browser, you get the... But really, Twitter positioned themselves as being a platform. Everything uses the Twitter API. My clicker's not working, there we go. Yeah, everything uses the API. Everything is just a client of the API. So what we're looking at in the browser isn't the Twitter website, it's the Twitter web client. They're very, very determined to talk about Twitter being the platform and the API. So, let's have a look without JavaScript, since that's what I tend to like to do. And until quite recently, this is what you'd get if you hit twitter.com without any JavaScript capabilities. You'd get empty, horrible experience, nothing there. To their credit, they changed that. A few months ago, they improved how this works. So now, it's great. You'll see this, they're not just using the no-script tag just to say, need JavaScript, go away. There's actually some good guidance here. It's nicely styled. It tells you how to get to an alternative, go to the mobile site that doesn't have the same requirement of JavaScript. So that's great. Except kind of it's only halfway there because, yes, come to twitter.com and you'll get your content, your timeline. But what happens if you hit this? So this is a URL for a particular tweet, one piece of content. But without Java, you get the same thing. It's actually a different address sending us to the same content. It shouldn't, the timeline, it should serve a discrete tweet. And that seems a bit broken to me. There's this argument perhaps that, well, no one navigates the web now without JavaScript. Turns out that's not true. I mean, there are lots of environments where JavaScript isn't available. Certainly lots of large government bodies, large enterprises often are in very restricted conditions that don't have JavaScript enabled. And anyway, that's kind of missing the point, because what about the contract of the... How about the fact that we should be able to get sent at a particular address? If the addresses for content stop working, that we get into a position that things taken down. Don't know if you recall, during the recent kind of Pippa and SOPA debates that were raging in the USA, lots of big sites wanted to make a point about what would happen if the content vanished. Wikipedia put this up. So this is an example of what the web would be like when the addresses don't resolve to content. And they just did this for a day to make a bit of a point. The thing I love about this, actually, is that the way that they took their content down is they used JavaScript to show this when you got there. So in fact, if you turn JavaScript off, you get the full content, which is kind of a nice irony, I think, in the way that they made this point. But let's look again a little bit more about Twitter and what they were doing. And they were using this thing, right? They're using this hashbang, the shebang. Recently, they're making real efforts to get away from that and start using proper URLs again. But the damage is done a little. Even if they've for a little while, they get traffic to their site. They get a lot of attention, and people linking to those discrete tweets now are linking to a particular pattern in their URL. So they have to maintain that forever. Granted, it's not a large overhead, but it's one little cut, and you die by 1,000 cuts. They've already introduced this aspect of link. They'll always have to try and work around. So it's really dangerous. So now they're using this bang, right? And everyone knows of Ricky Martin. We should see more of him. Why were they using the hash bang? Well, there's a good reason historically to use the hash, right? Any content that you put in the URL as part of the hash, you could get at programmatically through JavaScript using window.location.hash. So that was really useful for creating kind of client-side processing so that you could bring it into the browser, not have to do a route back to the server and back again to bring these things to life. And critically, that meant you could build things that would just worked in the front end with no server-side dependency that enabled history navigation. So you could use the back button. Now, enabling this back button is really important when you're building out applications. But the problem is that by doing so, the content that's being retrieved is just being retrieved through JavaScript. And that's opaque to the Google bot. Google can't get to that, can't index it, doesn't know it exists. So what Google did, and you could understandably, is they introduced this pattern, the Google Ajax crawling pattern. And you can read all about it on Google's site. They document it very carefully. And what they're doing there is they're documenting how the Google bot will go and get content that you hide away in Ajax. So normally it wouldn't be able to find that content, but nowadays it can. But you have to use this convention. One way of bringing kind of this interface excitement and shizzle into the web, but it kind of compromises the fundamentals of how the URI is intended to be used. But you don't have to do that. Thankfully, there are some examples that do a really nice job of this. Do people know GitHub? Imagine that there's a lot of developers in the room, so people are aware of GitHub. I'm a fan of GitHub. I'm a bit of a GitHub fanboy. But GitHub did something a while ago. This isn't new. This has been around for a little while now. But on the GitHub kind of code page, where you can navigate through the code, what they did is just something very, very simple. So as you navigate your way through the code here, it's going off and getting new content in and giving you a continuity by just kind of flooping in this new content, just kind of flying this in without an entire page reload. So the context is there, and it updates the kind of breadcrumb that you can navigate to. All good. Nothing groundbreaking really there happening at all, and that's been possible for a very, very long time. The thing that I really like is that when they do that, they take the care to update the address. So the URI is changing as they do that without it going off and making a full page request and changing the location of that, which means that at any point you can bookmark your location and that bookmark works. It resolves to content. It's very easy to maintain links to that site and understand where you are in your journey through looking at the URL. And that's really good. And the way that they've done that is they're just using the 5 history API, which is a JavaScript API in modern browsers. And I'm not going to show much code, but this is one little bit of show. So this, leveraging jQuery to grab the click events on the sliders, all they're doing is, or you can barely see it, but the top line there, the history.pushState. So they're calling this pushState method on the history API to pass into the history container in the browser information about the path to that content and the URL and what have you. And once they've done that and they've populated that part of the browser's history knowledge, they move on to the next section, which is this $.get, which is just standard AJAX to go and get the content from the address, bring that back to the browser, and when it arrives, fly it into the page. It's kind of simple stuff. It's hijacking links in the way that we know is good practice. The other side of that is to listen to the pop state event fired when you use the navigation, the forward and back buttons, browser. And again, they intercept that and take you to the right content, flying in the right content just in the client. So this is an example of using this client-side routing and client-side processing in a fairly compassionate and subtle way, but it's really nice. I think it's a really nice example. And kind of the practice is really fashionable at the moment in applications. There are lots of single-page applications where everything is in the client now. They seem to be the thing of the moment. And thankfully, there are libraries to help us do that. Helper libraries, there are 1,000,001 of those at the moment for everything you can think of. But there's a nice example for the history API, a thing called Levi Roots, which was written by Paul Kinlan, who works at Google. That's a nice little library. Just 2K of JavaScript, and it's completely unobtrusive, so you build your page as you would without it, and then massive enhancement to innate capability on top. That's great, I think. So kind of nearing the end of my time, but I just wanted to touch on kind of demos and developer tools. So this is a demo site. Again, it feels like I'm picking on Adobe, and I don't intend to. Adobe do lots of good stuff, but there's some examples that maybe they're not so great. So this is an example site put up by Adobe a while ago about HTML5, and the first thing you'll notice is that it talks about CSS3, but that's okay. We agreed earlier on that it's the big umbrella term that we'll just use for this. So this is just CSS3 animations and transitions, and you can interact with it and play with this thing. It's kind of exciting, and it demonstrates some of the capabilities of the modern browsers. But I've got a few gripes about this. For instance, this is using the capabilities of the real bleeding edge browsers, right? So why then, if you look at the very top, are we using this hashbang again? This is built entirely in the front end in JavaScript, and we're using hashbang. But that was only ever used when browsers didn't have the history API. Now, granted, not every browser does, but the audience for this do. This is all about the latest cutting edge stuff. So it kind of feels like we're starting to borrow those conventions we've seen in other sites and saying, those are best practice because the big boys do it, let's do that ourselves. That kind of irks me a little bit. If we do this, let's do this thing again, let's turn off JavaScript, how this behaves as an outstanding example of citizen of the web, well then, all of a sudden the expressive web gets a lot less expressive. There's no content on here. You can click around, but you're not going to get anything. And it doesn't matter what your URL is, it's always going to be the same kind of hidden content, which is, I think is kind of dangerous. So, you could argue that this is just a demo. It's just to demonstrate, some of the capabilities. Bruce Lawson from Opera put it really beautifully when he said, the biggest danger is when that demo leaks into production websites. I've been guilty of that in the past. I think a lot of us have seen examples of things that look like that's the way to do stuff. Big sites are doing it. We learn from that, and then we use it ourselves. And examples like the one we just showed, I think, are really bad for letting these experimental approaches bleed into production websites. It's kind of dangerous. So, wrapping things up, I've just got a couple more minutes left. Developer tools. Certainly, I think the time for the HTML5 development world to have all kinds of developer tools to help you build things. There are already lots of libraries and utilities that you can make use of. Good stuff happen. But I'm here to be Mr. Doom, and a bit of a word of caution. The thing that you need to be careful about, again, it's not Adobe that's the problem. It's just that this is green and it fit my slide. Adobe Edge is an example of a tool where you can write things that then generate HTML for you. And the thing you need to be careful about is the magic that's going on. If we don't understand exactly what that's building and how it's building it, given that it's going to go into a web browser, I think there's just there. Now, I think we've all been there in the past where tools that have been intended to help make life easier for us have not done the best job. So, let's just remember, I think, that we need to take care of the URI. It's important. Things we need to consider all of the users, not just the users around us that we develop with and that are signing on the dotted line for what you're delivering to them. It's important, I think, to value both the pixels and the aesthetics behave, but also how what we're building behaves as a citizen of the web and the fact that it should be around for a long time. Progressive enhancement, I like to think of doing so gracefully. So don't start from an empty body tag and enhance from there. Have something functional to start with. And also it's worth remembering that dinosaur theme parks end really badly. So the message from me is experiments and really exciting time, but let's take care of the web. So with that, as I mentioned before, all of the assets and some of the resources I have are on these slides, and these slides are up on SlideShare now, and you can get to them from that address. So thank you very much. So I'm not sure if I've got like 1 minute left on here. I don't know if we've got any questions.
We have one minute left, so maybe some questions for Phil.
Is there something at the back there, or someone scratching their head? Okay, well, if there are no questions now, I'll be around all day. I'll be here in the evening. So, there's a question over there. I'm sorry.
No, please, with microphone, so they can hear.
I think we want to record it, so I'll repeat the question anyway. But
yeah.
if you have the microphone there.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if you could point us to another good examples of implementations that come to your mind.
Good implementations of the kind of things I've been talking about?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, well, GitHub was a lovely example, and they do a lot there. I think Twitter is starting to do better things, but one place that I think people are considered to be a bit ailing now is Flickr. Everyone's down on Flickr, but I think Flickr do some really nice things, especially with regards to progressive enhancement. I know that people are moving away from Flickr a little bit because they're kind of critical about its social implementation, but I think that without JavaScript it works beautifully, and they take a lot of care over the URL, and so there's some really good things that happen on Flickr both with and without JavaScript, so I think that's quite a nice example. I think what I'll do is I'll put a more exhaustive list of reference sites on these slides, so when they go up there'll be more on there as well, which will be probably a bit more useful.
Thanks.
Any more?
More questions, yeah.
One last one, otherwise I'll be in the pub later. You can. Oh, so there's one at the front.
Here, please.
What would you consider a decent baseline to start to progress from? I mean, if we go all the way back to like links and there's like no images, yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, what's a good baseline to enhance from? Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important question, and I think the answer is, hopefully, it depends. It depends a lot on what's the audience for your site, what's the purpose of it. There's lots of talk today about game development. Obviously, the fallback for that in the browser is going to be very different to a site that has a different audience and a different utility. I personally think that you should make your decision around what's the purpose that people will come to the site for, what information does it need to convey, and there should at least be content there for them to consume. I kind of like, I was critical of it a little bit on Twitter's implementation where we hit it without JavaScript. You just get your timeline and then it says, good luck to you. You navigate around, you can't get anything else. But it does at least give you an option on how you could experience elsewise. There's a link to where the content lives in the mobile version, and that works without JavaScript. And I think if that's a nice fallback that you can still navigate your way to. Search engines can find their way to that as well, and the content isn't hidden. So for me, I think as long as the core utility of the site is upheld, that's great. There's obviously a big overhead in building out sites where all of the functionality works with and without JavaScript, so using synchronous and asynchronous technologies. But it's a difficult one to to answer, and I battle with it on every site I work on. So it depends is the unhelpful answer to that. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Phil.